Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Trillium webinar on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and executive functioning. I think we're going to get started, although maybe we don't have all of our participants yet joining us, but we will get started so that we can be sort of cognizant of the time and hopefully finish up around the time that we planned. So just before we begin, this is our agenda for today's webinar, and just a few Zoom features to go over with you before we get started on our introductions. So throughout the webinar, you won't be able to see us. We'll be turning the camera feeds off just so that you can focus on the actual material and it doesn't get covered up with the camera feeds. You can see us, but we can't see you because of the webinar features. So if you have questions or comments, if you can please use the Q&A room or the chat room at the bottom of your screen to post your questions, and then we can stop periodically throughout the way to answer those questions. Sorry, I'm just a bit distracted because I see a question there in the chat. So maybe one of my colleagues could have a look at that for me. And as well, today's webinar is being recorded and it will be sent to you along with the slide deck following the presentation today. Please feel free to share this information with your colleagues and use it as you would like moving forward. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, please, Emily. Okay, and if we can put it in presentation mode. All right, so welcome everybody. My name is Shannon Scullion. I am seconded from the Halton District School Board, and I am currently working at Trillium Provincial School in the role of Resource Services Consultant. And I have two other colleagues that work in the same role as I do at Trillium. And then one of them is joining us today. And as well joining us today is Emily, who is from our technology department within the school. If Emily and Fleur can just say a quick hello. Oh, Fleur, your volume's off. Oh, for some reason it's not working, but that's Fleur, you can wave. And go ahead.
I can quickly introduce myself, Shannon.
Yep.
Perfect. So hi, everybody. My name is Emily Tuck, and I'm the Assistive Technology Advisor at Trillium Demonstration School this year. So I'm also an Ontario certified teacher. I have experiences working in Dufferin Peel Catholic District School Board and Halton Catholic District School Board. So I have a background in spec ed, teaching ELL, assessment and evaluation. So in this role, I'm hoping to encompass all of those things, and especially with our focus on tech here, especially this year. So I'm trying to mix all of those together and provide personalized learning approaches for all of our students here at Trillium.
Thank you, Emily. So as I said, I'm Shannon Scullion. I'll be leading the webinar today. Emily's going to join us at the end of the webinar to share a few technology tips. My passion is special education. I've been in special education for just over 20 years, and I've done a variety of roles. I've worked as a special education resource teacher. I've worked in self-contained classrooms for students with behavior and mental health needs. I've been a teacher in the past at Trillium Provincial School. And as well, I've had the opportunity to work at 2 Ontario school boards as a psych ed consultant. So I have a lot of deep passion and commitment for special education, and I'm hoping to share a lot of that knowledge with you today in our webinar. Okay, so we'll get moving on, and we're going to turn our camera feeds off.
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly turn it off.
Okay, so as we saw in our agenda, we're going to start today's presentation with a look first at ADHD. and then move into a look at executive functioning, and then talk a little bit about some strategies for both the classroom and the virtual classroom. So if we look at ADHD and the current medical understanding of this condition or disorder, we can start first by talking about the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And it's a manual that's used by regulated health professionals in the field in order to do assessment and diagnosis of a variety of mental disorders and conditions. It does not provide treatment suggestions and options and strategies. It simply is a way of guiding assessment and diagnosis. So we can find ADHD and the diagnostic criteria for that within the DSM-5. ADHD is listed in the DSM-5 as a neurodevelopmental disorder. And that means basically that the onset of symptoms are developmental and occur in that developmental period of a child's life. So they are actually deficits that impact a child significantly, like either socially, academically, personally. There's a number of neurodevelopmental disorders listed in the DSM-5. Some examples are learning disabilities, speech and language disorders, Tourette syndrome, Fragile X. So a number of disorders fall underneath this category. Autism and ADHD are probably the most prevalent or common diagnoses that happen underneath this category within the DSM-5. So if we look at ADHD, and you may see when you see it written in psych ed assessments or provided in a diagnostic statement from a physician, you may see some coding or some numbers right beside the diagnostic statement. So you can be diagnosed with ADHD sort of in like 3 areas. So there's an inattentive presentation, there's a hyperactive impulsive presentation, and a combined presentation. So I think in the past it used to be called ADD versus ADHD, but currently this is the language that's being used. And if you do see codes, so inattentive has its own code. So right there it's 314.00, and then there's a bracket code. So each of the 3 areas has its own code. So don't be confused by that. It's simply the way that it's designed and written up in the DSM. And as kids grow older, what we do know is that symptoms change over time and as they grow and develop. So hyperactivity is something that is seen very often in young children. So as kids grow and develop and mature into adulthood, we can sometimes see the presentation of the ADHD change. We do know that it is a lifelong condition, but it can change over time. One thing that we need to see, oops, sorry, I'll let you know, I just a couple more points on this slide. Thank you, Emily. One thing that we need to see is onset sort of prior to age 12. So there needs to be sort of a historical pattern of challenges around those behaviors related to ADHD. It can't just be something situational. So for example, a sudden trauma in the child's life and all of a sudden they're inattentive. We would not want to diagnose anything under such conditions. We need to see that the ADHD behaviors are far-reaching so that they're not just occurring in one setting. So they need to occur across one or more environments. So at home, school, out in the community. And in order to meet the diagnostic criteria, there has to be a significant impact in the child's life that is impacting their social, academic, or other areas of functioning. There is a continuum of severity that's considered when diagnosing, and that can be from mild, moderate to severe. So you may see that written up in the diagnostic statement. we usually try to differentiate the diagnoses. So you want to make sure that the attention difficulties aren't sort of the main result of some other disorder that's really more of a primary consideration and description of the child's challenges. So really trying to differentiate and decide which disorder best fits the student's needs and behaviors that they're presenting with. On the right-hand side there is a little bit of sort of data for you. So the data 1 in 20 individuals in Ontario and 1 in 2 in every classroom is the most recent data that's coming out of the Learning Disabilities Association of Ontario. And then there is a breakdown there of the 3 types of ADHD and their prevalence. And always keeping in mind that children with ADHD are very consistently inconsistent. So they change and their behaviors change daily, and that's a normal part of the condition. And that no 2 children with this diagnosis will present the same. So again, another challenge for us as educators, and it just speaks to the fact that we really do need to get to know our students when we're working with them. Okay, we can try the next slide, please. Thank you, Emily. So here's just a little bit of a breakdown on the subtypes of ADHD. So the inattentive symptoms will often look, the child will have more internalized behaviors. So they may seem on the outside sort of unmotivated or lazy. They may seem tuned out or uninterested, but really what's happening is they're having difficulties focusing their attention on details. They'll make lots of mistakes. They have a difficulty holding their attention and sustaining it. It requires a lot of mental effort for them to focus. So trying to see it through a positive lens will always be helpful in terms of programming for the student. If we look at the hyperactivity and impulsivity behaviors that we typically see, these are sort of the ones that really pop out in the classroom. They're hard to ignore. They're the ones that as teachers make us sometimes very frustrated. And these kids tend to externalize their behaviors. So they may run out of the classroom. They may climb on furniture. They may be up and down from their seat, having trouble waiting turns. Sometimes we can see aggression, blurting out. So more of those externalized behaviors. And when looking at making a diagnosis, clinicians will look for a number of symptoms in each of these areas in order to meet diagnostic markers. So keeping in mind that, you know, even though the child may appear sort of disengaged or maybe, you know, overly dysregulated, that it's not their fault, that they do really struggle with these things, and it really is a brain disorder, and we really have to try to understand the individual child's strengths and needs in order to program for them and support them. We can move to the next slide. Thank you, Emily. So in this slide, we're just going to talk in a little bit more detail about how ADHD is diagnosed. So it is diagnosed by a regulated health professional. So within the educational system, we can see information come in from a doctor. It can be a family doctor, it can be a child psychiatrist, a pediatrician, that states that a child has meets this diagnostic criteria and has a diagnosis of ADHD. Someone that is within the health profession outside the school system generally does not need to provide a lot of assessment data. I've even seen it written on a medical script. This child meets diagnostic criteria for ADHD. So usually what the physician will do is through observation and interview and meet with the family, they may even talk to the school and gather information, and they'll go through the DSM-5 criteria and make sure that the child is meeting those diagnostic markers, and will provide that a diagnosis if they meet those. Now within the school setting, We usually are lucky enough to have a little bit more information. So this is usually done by our psych ed consultants within our school boards, and they'll do a lot more testing, and this is usually done. I'll get into it in a bit more detail in the coming slide, but generally if you look at the questionnaires, they're done both at home and at school. So the big questionnaires that are used in the field that we see most of the time in psych ed assessments in the schools are the Connors questionnaire. And the Connors is nice because it has a specific index right within the questionnaire that measures the symptoms and provides diagnostic markers for the subtypes of ADHD. The BASC system of questionnaires is often used, and as well the brief, which is a measure of executive functioning, which we're going to talk about again a little bit later. So sometimes we can see varied results in these questionnaires, and we just mentioned the fact that ADHD, in order to meet diagnostic markers, has to be present in more than one environment. So sometimes we can get elevations on these questionnaires in the school environment, but not in the home environment. And that just means perhaps that the demands in the one environment are so significant that the child doesn't have the skill set or has lagging skills and isn't able to cope. Often the demands in the educational setting are more challenging for a child than the home setting. So it's not uncommon to see different results, and sometimes a diagnosis isn't able to be made because of the inconsistency across environments. But despite that, what you can still do as educators is look at that profile of strengths and needs that are presenting in the school setting and provide strategies and accommodations to address that. So we can still program for the child even though they may not always get the diagnosis of ADHD. Okay, and if we can move on to the next slide, please, Emily. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the psych ed assessment and what we might typically see in the educational environment and what you might want to look for in terms of picking up a psych ed and trying to understand the student that you're working with. So background information. So all psych ed reports will have these sections in them. So background information. And in this section, what the examiner is trying to do is really sort of look at a historical presence to see whether or not there's some sort of background and support for this diagnosis. So things that you might see written in this section that are indicators of ADHD are, kids that have, and right back to kindergarten report cards, like having difficulties following directions and routines, social challenges like problem solving with peers or communicating with peers, difficulty completing tasks or following the teacher's instructions, losing their belongings, being unprepared, needing support to follow routines like, putting their coats on and lining up. You'll see academic challenges, letter sound delays, lots of reversals, poor organization. And you'll see that these problems, if you read the report cards, persist over time and become bigger or broader as the student gets older. Sometimes you'll see reported in the background information that there's a family history because we know there is a strong genetic link with ADHD. So you might see that reported in the psychoeducational assessment. In terms of the behavior observations, so these are observations that an examiner will make when conducting a psych ed assessment. So a psych ed assessment is generally conducted in optimal learning conditions, so in a really quiet environment where the child's comfortable, lots of breaks given. So, we don't have a lot of distractions. So what is that child like in that optimal learning environment, as much as we can set that up? So a child that has ADHD is very obvious if it is significant through that child's behavior in this one-to-one environment. So things such as They'll need instructions repeated. They'll miss instructions or be easily confused. Often they will blurt out and have an impulsive responsive style. So they'll speak over top of the examiner. They'll turn pages and touch, materials that are in front of them, whereas kids without these challenges won't do things like that. They'll constantly be fidgeting, much like they would be in the classroom, moving around and up and down all over their chair. They'll require lots of breaks, sometimes lots of excessive talking. Their frustration levels are often low. We'll see low sustainability in getting through the assessment tasks and giving up easily. Easily distracted, like for example, by a hallway noise or even something really faint, such as a bird outside the window, will cause them to lose their focus and is a sign for the examiner of, ADHD. Within the psych ed assessment, you'll see lots of variability within that cognitive and academic profile. Generally, you'll see some nice, strong cognitive scores within some of the indexes on the IQ test, but definitely lots of variability is common for ADHD kids. You'll often see comorbidity. So oftentimes we'll be able to see a learning disability. Maybe there's some signs of anxiety. So there's often things that go along with the ADHD. Oppositional defiant disorder is another common diagnosis that goes along with ADHD. And then, as mentioned in the previous slide, you'll see question errors, and you'll generally see elevations in both or one or the other externalizing and externalizing behavior. So all of this stuff will be reported and sort of explicitly stated within the psych ed assessment. And then that information will be communicated into what we can do as teachers in the recommendation section. The two little pictures on the side are just pointing out that it's important to sometimes look at the maladaptive behaviors of these students in a positive way. So the student at the top, it could have been an example of that student using upcycled materials in their primary science class to make a bridge or a structure. And the student decided to make a superhero vehicle. So trying to see the students' sort of disabilities in a positive way and through a positive lens. And the child at the bottom is our child that needs opportunities to move about. That might be a child that in the classroom is climbing or running and putting themselves in danger because of that and has lots of energy. So trying to look through a positive lens. Okay, and if we can move to the next slide, please, Emily. So we've all seen an iceberg analogy for various things. So we know that when we see, and we can use this analogy for ADHD, because when we see the child's behavior in the classroom, we really are only seeing the tip of what's happening. I have included a link if you click on the explaining ADHD to teachers. There is a link because it's hard to read that can take you directly to this document if you'd like to access it and print it out yourself, but I'm going to walk you through it a little bit. So what we see on the top or the tip of the iceberg is all of the big things. So the hyperactivity, the impulsivity, the inattention, but underneath that is a whole lot of other challenges that the child with ADHD faces. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the neurotransmitter deficits because this relates to medication. And I'm going to explain to you sort of where the breakdown is there. But students with ADHD have difficulty producing neurotransmitters. So those are the messages that go between the neurons in our brain. So we send messages along synapses or pathways or roadways. So the synapses go between the neurons and the neurotransmitters go back and forth. The messages go from one neuron to another neuron along a pathway. The problem with ADHD is sort of twofold. That message that is in the pathway or the roadway doesn't stay in that roadway very long. It just sort of absorbs and moves away and gets lost and not delivered to the other neuron. And then the other problem with ADHD is both at the sending and the receiving end of those neurons. So not a lot of messages are sent. So they just sort of come out of the door slowly, and the receiving neurons are often blocked or closed and don't allow those messages in. So when a child takes medication, it actually speeds things up. So even though the child looks like they may have been running on a motor on their own, with medication, it's actually a stimulant that we're giving them so that we can speed up these messages and we can speed up the opening of those doors to send the messages and receive the messages. So there's a lot of actual brain dysfunction that's going on at that neurotransmitter stage underneath the surface of kids with ADHD. We look at executive functioning difficulties. We're going to talk obviously a little bit more about that in the slides to come. So there's huge deficits, as we know, with ADHD students in that area. Impaired sense of time is a huge thing for kids with ADHD. They really have poor judgment of time. They really hate waiting. They have trouble in lines where you might think that it's a transition that's causing them to have difficulty, but really maybe it's the ability to manage the time because their brains really have a hard time waiting. They're the procrastinators because of that poor judgment of time. Sleep is another area that's very challenging for kids with ADHD. And there's a lot of research that shows that their circadian rhythms are very off. Falling asleep and waking up are hard. You'll often hear families talking about huge morning battles and irritability. Maturity is another big thing with ADHD. And we know the ADHD brain matures at approximately 2 to 3 years, a 2 to 3 year lag compared to neurotypical brains. Rewards and punishment are something that really don't work well with ADHD kids. They really don't remember and have a lot of hindsight into the past and awareness, even though if you were to talk to them when they're feeling calm and rational, they could explain it. But in the moment, they are very impulsive, and that impulsivity just takes over and they can't think in the moment. And long-term rewards sometimes are challenging because they don't have the sustainability and the planning ability in order to make that happen and wait for it. Underneath that iceberg is comorbidity. So additional diagnoses that often go hand in hand with ADHD, such as severe learning disabilities or anxiety and depression. And then there's often a lot of frustration that exists within a student with ADHD because they're having problems regulating their emotion. They have a short fuse and they react emotionally to challenges. So there's underneath that iceberg, we have to keep in mind that there is a whole lot of things that the student is struggling with and a whole lot of ways that we can support them if we really understand where their specific needs are. Thank you, Emily. If you can move to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to move into some executive functioning explanation here. And actually, maybe before I do that, I see that there's a couple questions in the chat, in the Q&A. I'm going to see if we can have a look at that.
I've been monitoring it, Shannon.
Okay.
So I know a couple people have said there's just issues viewing the slides right now.
Oh, okay.
So I just mentioned, I'm not sure if you said this at the beginning, but that the slideshow will be sent out following the webinar.
Okay.
So it will be visible soon.
Okay. I apologize. I don't know why that's happening. Okay, but I will continue. And yes, you can always have a look at the slide deck when it's sent to you today. So in this next slide, we're going to go, or section, we're going to go on and talk about executive functioning and the connection to ADHD. So There's really strong research and evidence that ADHD is associated with weaknesses in executive functioning. Not everybody with ADHD has executive functioning weaknesses, however, many do. Executive functioning is processed or occurs at the front of our brains. It's that prefrontal lobe, the frontal cortex of our brains, where all of this takes place. We know that with students that have ADHD, there's a 2 to 3 year lag in maturation of this area of the brain. Executive functioning can also strongly be linked, and there's a lot of parallels with learning skills on the report card. Okay. If we think of executive functioning as the conductor of the orchestra, it's a nice analogy to help us sort of understand how it works. So executive functioning or functions are the mental skills that we all need to make decisions and to carry decisions out. They guide our thought and our behavior. So the conductor of an orchestra or the conductor of our brain helps to self-monitor, helps to shift and think our behavior, helps us to be flexible in situations and manage our emotions, helps us start tasks that are big and overwhelming and continue on and make a plan. They help us organize our time and our belongings. They help us monitor our behaviors and our engagement in tasks. Weaknesses in executive functioning can often be seen as a hidden or described as a hidden learning disability. And an interesting fact is that as a child grows older, the demands for executive functioning become higher because as a child gets older, we of course expect them to be more independent. And in fact, kids with executive functioning weaknesses are not able to become more independent, and they have huge deficits and lagging skills and require a whole lot of increased support as they get older. I'm going to draw your attention to an important curriculum or ministry document that's put out and just shows the importance of executive functioning skills and keeping those in mind as we're programming and working with kids in schools. But Caring and Safe Schools in Ontario is a ministry document that was put out for principals and superintendents primarily in order to help address issues with students' behavior through instruction and intervention. It's a document that helps guide in terms of building a caring and safe school culture and provides a framework for looking at it and addressing various needs related to mental health, communication disorders, and it explicitly talks about executive functioning needs. So it does recognize the importance of understanding these needs, especially in older students, and making sure that we provide a program with the right accommodations and strategies to address these needs so that students can be successful. Okay, and if we can go on to the next slide, please, Emily. So executive functioning deficits can be associated with a number of disorders. So on the left side there, I've listed a number of disorders that commonly have as part of that disorder executive functioning needs or deficits. So certainly ADHD and learning disabilities. So here at Trillium Provincial School, we have most of our students have both of those diagnoses, the first two, and require quite a bit of support because executive functions are a strong area of deficit for them. Now, in terms of measuring executive functioning, there's no one test that you can sort of pick up the psych ed assessment and look for an executive functioning test. Executive functioning is measured in a variety of different assessment tools. For example, it's measured in some of the questionnaires, such as the brief is one questionnaire that directly measures executive functioning, but the Connors and the Basque that we mentioned before, they both have measures of executive functioning within those. The WISC 5, that's the IQ test. sort of the gold standard one that we see in many psych ed assessments. There is some measures within some of the subtests on the WIS that look at executive functioning. One that loads heavily is working memory. The NAPSI or visual motor integration tests are other processing tests that are administered that also look at areas of executive functioning. The Stroop color and word test, as well as the DCAF. So those are some of the things that you may see examiners do in a psych ed assessment when they're trying to have a look at whether or not executive functioning is impaired or intact. And what you'll see them reporting on in the psych ed are where on the far right of this slide where it talks about the skills measured. So you may see it reported that a student has problems in some of these areas, for example, inhibiting behaviors or monitoring or shifting, initiating. And these are the things that you want to find within the psych ed and you really want to understand, because these are the things that are going to guide your instruction, and you're going to include these on your IEP. Be careful, and I caution you not to include all of these. Often a kid that has executive functioning weaknesses will have lots of areas that are weak in terms of these executive functioning skills. And what you want to do is pick 2 or 3 areas that you know you can focus on within that term and within your classroom in order to work on and support. You don't want to list all of them. So you might want to work on improving 1 or 2 and then just providing accommodations for the rest of areas of need. Okay, thank you, Emily. Move on. So this is just trying to bring to light a little bit. I'll give you a second, what we might see in the classroom. So I'll give you a second to have a little look at that cartoon. So what I like about that cartoon is that the child feels understood and sort of validated, right? Because somebody finally understands, and he finally understands what it's like to be him and to struggle the way that he does. So I think it's really important that we kind of keep an eye on the lens that we're looking through. That we know that students with ADHD can be some of the most challenging within our buildings, but we really need to look at their challenges as lagging skills, and that they would do well if they could, and they need us to teach them the way. So these are just some examples of some of these sort of challenges that you might see in the classroom, and really be careful to look at it through an asset lens and what we can do to help the student. So, you know, difficulty taking turns. You're constantly having to tell the child no or stop that, and there's often safety issues involved there. Needing support to get started and make decisions. Keeping track of time, getting stuck in their thinking. They're the student who's stuck at the end of the day is sort of all over. Their lockers are messy. And emotionally just challenges regulating themselves and overreacting to small problems. So if we look at sort of grouping these challenges, and sometimes you can see it reported this way in a psych ed as well. There's sort of 3 main groupings to executive functioning challenges, and kids can have problems in 1 or all of these areas. So around that sort of planning and prioritizing and organizing area. Then the second part is controlling the emotional responses. So that's the kid that, you know, will be having a good conversation with a peer and then all of a sudden bop them on the head because it's just an impulse and they had to do it. That's another big area that we see. And then the last area is working memory, which I'm going to talk to you about in a bit more detail. If you can move to the next slide, please, Emily. Working memory is an important area to understand when working with kids with ADHD and executive functioning weaknesses. Working memory is the ability to hold and manipulate pieces of information in our active conscious awareness. So it's different from short-term memory. Short-term memory is being able to put information or code it, put it in your memory and retrieve it within a 10 to 15 second time frame. Working memory is even faster than that. It's a live, active, here and now memory. And a nice analogy, which you may or may not have seen, is the mental workbench. And it's an easy way to understand working memory by visualizing it as a carpenter's workbench. The carpenter temporarily places tools and materials on the workbench as she builds new products. And the workbench has a small size and only a few items can be placed on it at once. So similarly, you temporarily store information in your working memory when you're solving a problem in the here and now and you're making decisions. So working memory only has a very small capacity and can only hold a few items at once. And it's used and woven right throughout our school day. And we've got some examples of that coming up. So if you can go to the next slide, please, Emily. And just to be conscious of the time, we are nearing the end of our presentation, and we'll likely go over a few minutes. If you have to leave the webinar, we will be sending you the recording, and we understand if you have to log off right at 1:45. We'll probably go about 5 minutes over in today's webinar. So what will you see in the classroom with a student that has executive functioning deficits? These deficits will be woven into all subjects and will be visible all throughout the day. And in this slide, we provided some examples of how it impacts reading, how it impacts writing, and how it impacts mathematics. And then, you know, it would impact some of the other subjects such as history or geography because of the challenges with the reading and the writing and the math. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide. So now what do we do? So we know that despite some things, a lot of kids will learn with our good teaching as they mature, and they'll learn things incidentally. But what we do know for sure is that kids that have severe learning disabilities with significant executive functioning needs will not learn incidentally and will struggle and will not be as mature as their peers. They need explicit, systematic teaching with lots of repetition of skills in order to really consolidate and learn those. We should not assume that they know something just because of their age. They have many lagging skills and deficits, and they may appear, for example, unmotivated, but we really need to ask what's underneath that motivation or disengagement and really try to figure out the underlying lagging skills. Just like if we had a student that was a weak reader, we wouldn't hesitate to figure out what was wrong with that reading and try to improve it. So just like a student that is struggling with things like motivation and behavior, so really trying to figure out what's underneath that so that we can provide appropriate programming. And that we know with time and proper supports and accommodations, we can see a lot of improvement in executive functioning skills. If we can go to the next page, please. So what we do know about treatment and support is that a multifaceted approach works. I have included here just some famous people that have ADHD, and what we know about being, you know, overcoming challenges is that having a team or a circle of care around us and having things that we're good at and relying on our strengths will help all of the students pull through. So we really want to focus on a team approach, making sure at the school that we're doing all that we can to understand our learner. Make sure there's a child voice, calling the parents in for meetings. Does the child have a healthcare provider? So if they have a diagnosis of ADHD, is there someone that's monitoring that? Because that will be a very important part as a child grows and develops. So helping the family establish that circle of care for their child. Another big thing is to look at protective and risk factors. We of course want the protective factors to be much higher than the risk factors. So protective factors are things such as secure attachment, positive self-esteem, opportunities to be successful, such as in sports or music or other strengths, having coming from a loving home and feeling accepted, feeling a sense of belonging and connectedness at school, feeling part of a safe and inclusive environment, having extracurricular activities. So the student is having challenges academically throughout the day, but then goes home and attends a soccer, league where they're an all-star. So having protective factors that allow the child to feel good about themselves. And really trying to work with families and work within the school to reduce risk factors. So risk factors such as discrimination or bullying, working on friendships with kids, getting supports that the family might need if there's things like abuse or socioeconomic challenges. So really trying to be cognizant of what those risk factors are for these students. And then, of course, there's all of the strategies, accommodations, things we do within the educational environment, behavior plans to support our students. Collaborative problem solving is another really great approach to working with students with lagging skills. So that's the work of Ross Green and Stuart Abalon from Think Kids. You can just Google that. And it has the whole philosophy of kids do well if they can. If they can't do well, it's because of a lagging skill that we must teach and program for and provide support for. And then, of course, medication. So a lot of families are choosing that option as one part of the whole puzzle. And if a child is medicated, it doesn't mean that any of these problems will go away. It may help in calming the child so that some of our strategies and plans can have a deeper effect. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide. And I'm going to skip over this. I'll just mention it briefly, but basically, these are the things, sort of low-tech things that you want to have included on your IEP. So the instructional, environmental, and assessment strategies, these are just a small snippet of examples of things that we would typically see and have written in our IEPs. You'll see also these kind of strategies listed at the end of a psych ed assessment for students. So really having a look at what you want to work on, what skills you want to try to build, and then what skills you really want to just accommodate or bypass and support for the student. So it all really boils down to knowing your student and really taking the time to program and be smart about picking the goals and the appropriate strategies. Okay, and if we can go on to the next slide, please, Emily. So as we're moving into more virtual learning environments, given the pandemic, there's a whole lot to think about in terms of this type of learning. And virtual learning is a really, really, really challenging environment for students that have a diagnosis of ADHD and executive functioning needs. There's a huge high cognitive load that's involved in virtual learning. It requires the child to be really flexible in their learning style, to think on their feet, to be attentive, to organize themselves, to sustain their attention. So we know that all of those things are really hard for ADHD kids. So it can be exhausting for them. A lot of virtual learning is nonverbal, and we know that just even face-to-face conversation, approximately 80% of communication is nonverbal. So online, it's even more so, and that can be exhausting and very anxiety-provoking for students, especially those that have a nonverbal learning disability. scanning and looking at faces takes a lot of time and energy. You know, being flexible as teachers on whether or not they have their camera on might be a strategy, because having to look at everybody's faces can be really stressful. Interpreting silence and navigating that can be challenging for kids with executive functioning and ADHD. You want to encourage your students to ask for help, and as well build in times where you're stopping and asking how they're managing and really assessing those soft skills and their needs around executive functioning. If you see a weakness, look for a tool, and Emily's going to show us a few tools in the next slide that look at supporting those executive functioning needs. All right, so, and then of course, setting up the environment, much like we would in a classroom. So what are the expectations and routines and rules around virtual learning? So there's a lot to consider. This by all means is not an exhaustive list. There's a lot to consider in terms of virtual learning within the environment. And if we can go to the next slide, and Emily, if you'd like to explain a few of the things that, so at Trillium, we use a lot of assistive technology, and Emily's just going to show you just a couple examples of things that we find useful for students that have ADHD and executive functioning needs.
Perfect. Thank you, Shannon. So yeah, as Shannon just mentioned, we do use assistive technology tools a lot here at Trillium. So I just kind of wanted to briefly go over some of the AT tools that we use and just some other suggestions that might be worth looking into. So I have on the slide shown here a couple different programs that I've seen students use in the past that, as Shannon was talking about with executive functioning, really helps support these learners. So Microsoft OneNote, which is kind of set up as a digital binder. It's a note-taking program, so you can organize all your thoughts and ideas in different tabs. So it's really helpful for organizing and planning. Focus Me is a Google Chrome extension, so you can just add it to your toolbar. So it helps students with time management, and it's a web blocker, so it kind of helps with distractions that might get in the way for students who might get off task easily, and to help them focus on what they are doing. Miro is a online collaborative whiteboard platform, which is really helpful with mind mapping and brainstorming. So again, for that organization and planning process, it really comes in handy. So I can just quickly take you to OneNote platform just so everyone can quickly have a look while it loads. So it just, I'll let it load first before it. All right, there we go. Okay, so it's loading right now, but as you can see kind of on the left side of the screen here, that's kind of where you can have different sections. So this could be for students, maybe different subjects or a project that they're working on. And then pages here that you can add to it to kind of help maintain that organization. One feature I just really wanted to point out quickly are the tags. So if you click on the tags option, there's lots of different ones to choose from. So a to-do list, questions, highlighting things. So really helpful for students to organize their work. And even chunk their own material so that they can maybe create a to-do list, for example, and maybe for Monday, they'll have a few things that they'll set aside, and then for Tuesday, they'll have a few tasks. So really helpful for that. I'm going to quickly go back. Sorry, it's just little technical difficulties. And then Miro was another one that I mentioned. So for mind mapping, brainstorming, all that sort of stuff. So it could be for the planning process if it's a paper that they're writing or a project that they're working on. Maybe they want to organize their ideas, their supporting arguments, their evidence for whatever it is that they're explaining. So it's just nice to have another visual aid for them to kind of, you know, write their work rather than it being sentences or paragraphs. So it's nice to have kind of a different outlet for them to express their ideas. So let's see. Just gonna go back to the main slide. Sorry, it is just, oh, I'm gonna open it up again in 1 sec.
Maybe while you're doing that, I can answer the question from the Q&A
Sure.
room. Okay, so one of the questions was why school boards don't recognize ADHD as a disability. And that's a really great question. The reason why is ADHD is a recognized disability underneath the Ontario Human Rights Disabilities Act. You know, parents can get disability tax credits and that if the disability is severe enough. So it is a recognized disability. However, school is a little different because we use identifications, and our identifications are educational constructs that we as educators make up. So they don't sometimes align directly with diagnostic criteria. So there is no identification for ADHD. Sometimes some boards will use the behavior identification in order to identify a student that has significant learning needs and has an ADHD diagnosis. But basically that behavior ident is reserved in most boards for kids that have, you know, severe and far-reaching behavior challenges, whether or not there is an ADHD diagnosis or not. So unfortunately, there is no identification criteria specifically for ADHD, and that's because the identification criteria and diagnosis don't often align because they come from two separate areas, education versus medical. However, that shouldn't matter because we can still put in place an IEP and we can still have all the supports and the strategies for that student even without an identification. So they do have the right to have an IEP in order to support their needs within the educational setting. So I hope that helps answer your question. And I'll turn it back over to you, Emily, to finish up.
Perfect. Thank you, Shannon. So one other thing I just wanted to highlight quickly, other than the AT tools that I suggested, is something that a couple teachers, there we go. Sorry. All right, we're back in it. So hyperdocs are something lots of teachers at Trillium are using. It's a really helpful tool to use to kind of have all of your information located in one spot for students to access. So the hyperdocs that our teachers have created are digital unit and lesson plans. So they have tons of different activities, links to videos, different resources all embedded in one Google Doc. So I'll take you to one as an example that one of our teachers has created. So you can have a better idea of what it looks like and how to even create it. So there we go. So I'll just scroll down a bit, but pretty much this is for a math unit for equations and angles. So it's kind of broken up into the different sections of the unit. And within each section, there's just different links to worksheets, videos, assessments, games, something for everybody to work on. And it's nice because there's just a lot of variety. So for students who kind of have different interests and different ways of demonstrating their learning, there's something for everybody to work on. So it is a great tool that our teachers have been using, and especially for an online environment and an online classroom, it's easily accessible. So something to consider for everybody to try out if it's something that works for them. I'm going to go back to the slide. Sorry, it's just doing the same thing again, but I will open it back to the slide, and then Shannon, if you want to finish off, I'll give it to you.
Okay. Well, we're going to technical difficulties, working them through. All right. So just before we sign off, I just want to say that I think it's most important that when we have kids with ADHD and executive functioning, that we really take the time to know our learner and their strengths and needs. They will all be different, and each child will be different each day. So really take the time to go through the assessment data and match your IEP to that data, and then you will have a good, effective program. If we can move to the next slide, Emily, please. And here is our information if you want to reach out to us at any time. As we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, there's 3 of us, myself, Wendy, and Fleur in resource services at Trillium, and then Emily's our amazing technology person. And there's a link here to future webinars if you'd like to attend. When we send out the slide deck, we'll make sure that whatever the links are that were within the deck are working. So I think that was one of the comments in the Q&A. One of the links weren't opening up. So I apologize to those of you guys who could not see the slideshow, but hopefully you'll be able to access that when we send it. If not, please just send me an email and we'll figure out a way. And I want to thank you very, very much for taking the time to join us today. I know that everybody's busy and a lot of us feel like we're June tired. I know that that's been said a lot. So thank you for coming today and for your commitment to our special education students. Have a great day, everyone.